So this event marks the official launch of President Carter, the White House years, and we couldn't be more delighted to be hosting Stuart Eizenstat for it. Stu, who of course was Carter's chief domestic policy advisor, started working on his account of those White House years just after they ended in 1981. Now, 37 years later, he's finally done. And I have to say, it was worth the wait. Stu has produced a very big book, more than 900 pages worth, but it's comprehensive and authoritative, and most significantly, it's balanced. Carter, of course, left office unpopular, to say the least, and he's tended to be viewed as an indecisive and weak president. Remember the double-digit inflation and long gas lines, the micromanagement, the national humiliation of U.S. diplomats held hostage by Iranian revolutionaries for more than a year. But Stu makes a very persuasive case that Carter should actually be considered, if not a great president, then at least a good and productive one. And you'll hear why from him in a minute. I should note that during the past 4 decades in which the book was germinating, Stu did manage to do a number of other very noteworthy things. He moved in and out of some high-level positions in the Clinton administration at the Departments of Treasury, State, and Commerce, and he did a stint as U.S. ambassador to the European Union. He also served during that period as a special envoy on Holocaust-era issues, negotiating agreements with European governments on restitution of property and payment for slave and forced labor. This led 15 years ago to his book Imperfect Justice about those negotiations. He also came out several years ago with The Future of the Jews, which examined the impact of various global political, economic, and security challenges on world Jewry. These days, he heads the international practice at the D.C. law firm of Covington and Burling, where he's been since 2001. As Carter's domestic policy advisor, Stu was rather famous for his yellow legal pads, on which he took copious notes of meetings and phone calls. In all, he amassed more than 5,000 legal pad pages of notes, which, along with more than 350 subsequent interviews, formed the basis of his book. There's probably a lesson for all of us in such diligence in transcribing history while it happens. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Stuart Eizenstat.
Thank you very much. It's truly a labor of love of almost 4 decades. And it's very appropriate to launch this labor of love among people that I love and admire. And it is a special tribute to me to do it in this very bookstore, which was co-founded by a very dear late friend, Carla Cohen. Harry Truman was Jimmy Carter's political idol, and he carried with him into the Oval Office and on his desk his famous slogan, "The buck stops here." Both presidents left office highly unpopular. In the intervening years, Truman is remembered much more for his achievements than his faults. And I hope that my book will lead to a similar reassessment of Jimmy Carter as president, not just as a widely admired former president. I believe that there is compelling evidence that he was one of the most productive one-term presidents in American history, and as productive as many two-term presidents. Independent surveys have indicated that almost 70% of his legislative proposals were passed by Congress, just under the percentage of the master Lyndon Johnson. Walter Mondale put it very succinctly. We told the truth, we obeyed the law, we kept the peace. The rap on Jimmy Carter as president is based on several I's, or as I would say, I's. Iran, inflation, inexperience by the president and his Georgia mafia, and inter-party warfare with Ted Kennedy and the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. And I do not in my book in any way gloss over these problems. But at the same time, I was at his right hand seeing the many successes that these problems have obscured. And I felt a compulsion to balance the record, to demonstrate that he achieved lasting successes, and that those successes needed to be described before there were no living eyewitnesses left, and before there was an indelible imprint in people's minds of the president as having a failed presidency. Fortunately, you don't have to just take my word for it. I recorded it all. I recorded it copiously. Every meeting, every phone call, during the campaigns in '76, 4 years in the White House, on 103 legal pads, over 5,000 pages of contemporaneous notes. And that provides a unique view of this president, and I dare say of any president, from the inside. Not something concocted, actually written. And it was supplemented by over 350 interviews, and I was not selective on the interviews. I interviewed people who were positive and people who were negative. I interviewed Republicans and I interviewed Democrats. I pored over scores of documents, read all the night notes Secretary Vance sent every night to the president, and the weekly reports Zbig Brzezinski, the National Security Advisor, provided. Every book and article I could provide. And I did so because I knew that there was a high burden of proof for someone writing an inside account to do so with honesty and candor and not make it appear that it was a whitewash. So let me briefly share with you what I've learned about these momentous years in the 1970s. And let's start with the 1970s themselves, because it was a period of epic change. It was a decade in which the post-World War II centrist consensus had begun to unravel under the pressures of our first military defeat in Vietnam, urban violence, and persistent high inflation and high unemployment, that ugly term stagflation. It was a decade which saw the rise of a whole set of movements: the consumer movement, the environmental movement, the Black Power movement, the women's rights movement, and alongside of it, the pro-life movement. In fact, the ascendance of the evangelical political right occurred under Jerry Falwell during the Carter presidency. And as we were running for re-election, Falwell said that Carter, the most religious president perhaps we've ever had in history, was in fact not a real Baptist and was harboring homosexuals on his staff. Ronald Reagan put together in 1980, in defeating Carter, Richard Nixon's silent majority of blue-collar traditionalists, along with these evangelicals, for a coalition that endures to this day and remains central to President Trump's base. So let me take you through some of the achievements and just a few stories about how they occurred. On the domestic side, he passed 3 major energy bills in 4 years, which totally transformed our whole energy picture. The energy security we enjoy today is largely based on the foundations that he laid. Deregulating the price of natural gas and crude oil to stimulate production, putting conservation at the center of the nation's agenda, and beginning the new revolution in clean energy with solar and wind power. And these were hammered out in the last moments, appropriately, with 2 Democratic liberals from the House and 2 Republican conservatives in the Senate, in none other than the map room of the White House, where appropriately FDR followed the course of World War II. He was a great consumer champion, appointing consumer advocates, some even from Ralph Nader's Raiders, to oversee the regulatory agencies and industries, not selecting, as today, people from the industry to regulate their own industry. And he charged them, backed up by tough legislation that we passed, with totally transforming our entire over-regulated transportation system, trucking, rail, airlines, bringing competitive pricing in airlines. The new airline entries like JetBlue and Southwest could never have made it in the over-regulated environment that existed before. He brought air travel to the middle class. He democratized it. That may be uncomfortable when you're sitting in the middle seat of an economy class, but that's what he did. And he didn't stop there. Working with his pro-consumer regulators, he deregulated telecommunications, opening the way for the cable revolution. He revolutionized banking, allowing depositors to get market rates for interest. And even the beer industry, which was under heavy prohibition-era regulation that precluded the kinds of local craft beers which now proliferate. It was the deregulation of that industry that allows you to go out and enjoy those kinds of craft beers. He was the greatest environmental president since Theodore Roosevelt, literally doubling the size of our whole national park system that TR had created through the Alaska Lands Bill. And he did so over the stringent opposition of the Alaska delegation that wanted all of it available for oil and gas exploration. He brought them to the bargaining table by imposing monument freezes, and then made the last compromises by getting Senator Stevens, the senior senator from Alaska, and literally in the Oval Office, on Carter's hands and knees with a giant map of Alaska, showed Stevens every river and every mountain ridge that would be in the new boundaries. And Stevens was amazed that the president knew more about his state than he did after representing it for 25 years. Carter also followed through on the post-Watergate reforms we promised during the '76 campaign and that really propelled Carter into office. The Ethics Bill of 1978, which still very much exists today, required any public official at a senior level to disclose their assets, their prior employment, that of their families, put gift limits on when you're in office, and limited your ability to lobby your agency when you left. He also created inspectors general. There's not a week that goes by that these independent inspectors general in every agency tasked with rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse are not in the news. And he created the Office of Special Counsel to investigate wrongdoing by public officials. Sound topical? Two stories about this, one humorous, one not so humorous. The humorous story is I got caught up in the gift limit of $25 when a magazine reported, I think erroneously, that I had a great love of those penny Tootsie Rolls that I grew up with. And I got a giant, like lifetime supply of Tootsie Rolls from the Tootsie Roll Company. The legal counsel said, I'm not going to count them, but I think it's worth more than $25, and we had to return them. The problem was, when it got back to the company, the CEO angrily said, it was empty. We're still trying to find a Secret Service agent who stole my Tootsie Roll. More seriously and ironically, the first target of the independent counsel that we created was none other than Ham Jordan, the president's own chief of staff, who was accused by the notorious Roy Cohn the hatchet man for Joe McCarthy, and by the way, an early political mentor of Donald Trump, with a false allegation that Ham had snorted cocaine in a bar in New York. Totally fallacious. At a critical time in our re-election, Ham was sidelined $1 million in legal expenses that were never reimbursed. And Cohn did it to try to protect the owners of that bar who he represented. And yet, these reforms are critical, and they were enhanced by other things. Good government, post-Watergate. Every judge that Carter appointed was recommended by an independent body of experts, not just based on politics. And he made the greatest reform of the civil service system since its creation. This Southern president appointed more women and more African Americans, I call them blacks in the book because that's what they were called at the time, than all 38 presidents together previous to him, to senior positions in the administration and to judgeships. He also saved New York City and Chrysler from certain bankruptcy. He and Mondale created the modern vice presidency out of an office that was held in total disrepute. After the election, Mondale gave him a list of requests, all of which Carter granted. He checked every one of them off. Access to secret papers, access to all meetings, one-on-one weekly luncheons. And then Carter went one step further and gave him something he did not ask for, which was a prized office in the West Wing. In politics, like in real estate, everything is location, location, and location. And being just steps from the president was a crucial sign that he was an in vice president. That office remains to this day. There was a story that Mondale almost overreached because he had his legal counsel, Mike Berman, research the original architectural plans for the creation of the West Wing in the early part of the 20th century and found that his new office, in fact, had originally had its own bathroom, which Mondale prized. He later found, however, that during a remodeling in the Nixon administration, that bathroom was incorporated into the office of Henry Kissinger and now inherited by Zbig Brzezinski, and Mondale had the good sense not to fight over a bathroom, and he did just fine without it. But there's a story not told before that this vice president, fully incorporated into all decision-making, came within an eyelash of resigning or refusing to serve on the re-election ticket because of his anger at the so-called malaise speech and the mass cabinet firing. Nevertheless, the vice presidency is an institution it is today because of Carter and Mondale. His most courageous decision was made on inflation. And this bedeviled us from the first day to the last. We inherited high inflation of the decade of the 70s from Ford and Nixon. It got worse under our watch, and it was sent into stratospheric double digits by the Iran Hostage Crisis and the shutdown of Iranian oil. Carter tried everything possible, tight budgets, wage and price guidelines, anti-inflation czars, and nothing worked. And finally, over the opposition, and I can assure you opposition, of many of his senior advisors, he appointed Paul Volcker to head the Fed, knowing in advance, because Volcker told him, that he was going to choke the economy and squeeze inflation out, raising interest rates and causing high unemployment in the middle of a re-election campaign in 1980. Carter tells the wonderful story, which is validated by my interviews with him and with Volcker, of the interview that Volcker had for the job. Volcker is a giant of a man, 6'7", almost a foot taller than Carter, and came into the Oval Office, bald, cigar, owlish glasses, permanent scowl, and just sort of slouched over the couch in the Oval Office. Carter said he didn't know whether he was being interviewed for a job or he was interviewing Volcker. And Volcker told him plain and simple what he was going to do, and he still appointed him. And he let him do his job, And Volcker did the job, but not in time to save Carter. It was the low inflation that occurred in the Reagan period and that we enjoy to this very day that occurred because Carter took that risk. And this is in many ways emblematic of so much of what he did, the results of which occurred after he left office rather than before. In foreign policy, his achievements were even more astounding. The Camp David Accords were the greatest act of presidential diplomacy in history. He pored over intelligence reports before bringing Begin and Sadat to Camp David. What were they like? Where were their soft spots? Where might they compromise? He took them to the Gettysburg battlefield to show them the results that would occur if there were more wars. There were already 5 between them. He barred the press to prevent any leaks that might hurt the negotiations. And because Begin and Sadat were like 2 scorpions in a bottle and almost never met at Camp David themselves, he negotiated separately with each and with their aides. 13 agonizing days and nights, over 20 separate drafts which he wrote. And still on the 13th day on a Sunday, we were close, but Begin said, I've had it. I'm not going to make any more compromises. My bags are packed. I'm out of here. And it was not a bluff. The cars were already called. The plane was waiting in Washington to take him back. And Carter came up with a personal touch that changed history. He learned, going over these intelligence reports, of Begin's great love for his grandchildren. And he had his secretary, Susan Clow, find out the names of each one of those 8 grandchildren. And he personalized a signature to each of a picture of himself, Begin, and Sadat at Camp David, and hand-delivered it to Begin's cabin. He saw Begin start going through each of the photographs, looking at each of the names, saw his lips quiver, and tears come to his eyes. And Begin said, Mr. President, I'll give it one last try. And indeed, the rest is history. That treaty has been in force ever since, for decades, never once violated, central to Israel's security and to our national interest in the region. He was the first president to make human rights central to his foreign policy. For him, it was the flip side of civil rights at home. And he applied it to the military dictators in Latin America, reaching out to the democratic movements there, cutting off arms, insisting on the release of political prisoners, and then tying it to the Panama Canal Treaty, demonstrating that we wanted a new era in relations of equality with our Latin neighbors. And there's an interesting story there as well. The Panama Canal Treaty was perhaps the most brutal political battle we fought with Congress. We needed 2/3 of the Senate for a treaty that was wildly unpopular because we were handing back what people thought we owned to Panama. One vote, which was crucial, ended up being more cost-free than one could have imagined. And it belonged to Senator Hayakawa, the Republican conservative senator and vigorous opponent of the treaty. We learned through Mondale, and it was verified by his call to Carter. And he said, Mr. President, I will consider supporting this treaty if you will see me every 2 weeks and let me give you foreign policy advice. Oh, no, said the president. I wouldn't want to limit you like that. He supported the treaty. Carter never saw him. He also applied human rights to what I call the soft underbelly of the Soviet Union, reaching out to the democratic movements, to Sakharov, to the Soviet Jewish movement headed by Sharansky, and saving Sharansky's life. And Sharansky says so in his book by saying during his trial that he was not an American spy. And he combined that soft power with a significant military buildup, verified by a recent Pentagon study. Reagan built on Carter's buildup of the military. A tough reaction after Afghanistan, the SALT nuclear treaty, all of which Carter deserves credit for as doing his part and upon which Reagan built to unravel the Soviet Union. Clearly, the coup de grace of the administration occurred by Iran's cruel, radical Ayatollah Khomeini, who administered the first radical Islamic revolution in history. For 444 debilitating days, he held our own diplomats hostage in our own embassy in violation of every international norm. I'm very candid about the difficult decisions and mistakes that were made. It was, in my opinion, the greatest intelligence failure in American history, at least up until the point of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And why do I say that? Because the CIA had installed or reinstalled the Shah in 1953 to his throne. 6 presidents had lavished tens of billions of dollars of the most sophisticated American arms on the Shah, and yet the CIA did not know that his domestic support was on quicksand. He had lost total support across the board. They did not know that for 5 years he had been getting treatment for an incurable cancer. They didn't know that Khomeini, in exile outside of Paris, was sending provocative, radicalized cassettes to stimulate the revolution that overturned them. Imagine not knowing those. The most difficult decision Carter had to make was what to do once the hostages were taken. And here he made a seminal decision, and a controversial one, and one with which I disagreed. He told the families of the hostages, my prime #1 goal is to return your loved ones safely to the United States. And that, in the end, tied his hands for what might have been more robust action, like what Zbig and I recommended, which was manning the harbors or blockading the harbors like Kennedy did in Cuba to prevent any oil from coming out of Iran, to show that we would not tolerate this breach of international norms. Now, yes, it could have risked the lives of the hostages, for sure. Instead, we negotiated time and time again, for weeks, for months, for over a year, with no result. And to compound the problem, the president decided to hold himself up in the White House to show he was working full-time on the hostage crisis. And all this did was focus more attention on the crisis. The Nightline program of Ted Koppel, Walter Cronkite signing off every CBS broadcast with the day of the hostage crisis, was in part due to this focus that in part the president occasioned by his decision. It really backfired and made him the hostage in the White House. The failed rescue effort was a metaphor for many of the problems of the administration. The crash in the Iranian desert of all those helicopters, losing 8 American soldiers in the process. It was occasioned, I think, because of the over-complexity of the plan, but also because it required much more practice and coordination by military services who, unlike those today, were not used to coordinating and working together. There were 2 bright lights in Iran. One was the hostages were returned unharmed. The other is an untold story until this book of Iranian Jews. When the hostages were taken, all Iranians in the United States under the President's executive order were to be expelled. We knew that if we sent Iranian Jews and Christians and Baha'is back, that they would be subject to execution. And so through a very creative interpretation, and I can assure you I use the term creative, not mildly, of the visa laws, and by also a similar interpretation that allowed thousands to come out of Iran and safely into the United States, we essentially sat until the end of the administration on all their asylum applications, afraid that if they became public, it would endanger others. Right after the administration ended, I learned that the Reagan administration, not knowing of our secret deal, began to process those applications and to deny many of them, which would have meant sending them back. I called Elliott Abrams at the National Security Council under Reagan, explained what we had done. He agreed, and 50,000 Iranian Jews, Baha'is, and Christians came to the United States, and even more live there with their families today. When we think about the DACA dreamers, perhaps this is a lesson to be learned. Jimmy Carter was not one to brood over failure. We were overwhelmingly defeated in the 1980 election. And yet, Carter had, by any measure, the most successful transition out of any outgoing president. He finished the Alaska Lands Deal, the Superfund bill to clean up chemical wastes. He finalized the hostage crisis by settling the terms for their release. And in one interesting story, he launched the career of someone named Steve Breyer, who had been a staff aide on loan from Harvard Law School to Senator Kennedy. And after the election, Kennedy called me and said, "Stu, there's a vacancy on the First Circuit Court of Appeals. You know Steve, you know how brilliant he is, you know how he helps you on airline deregulation. I want the president to appoint him." I said, "Senator, there are two impossible hurdles." What are those? Number one, there's no love lost between Carter and you. He thinks you helped lose the election for him. And second, we've lost the Senate. Strom Thurmond's going to be the new chairman. Why would he want a lifetime appointment to go to a Democrat? "Stu, you take care of Carter, I'll take care of Thurmond." I went in thinking I'd never have a chance. Carter said, "You know, it'll be a tribute to the judiciary and to my administration." And he appointed him, and Steve will tell you that is responsible for him being on the Supreme Court today. My book is not just about policy, it's about real people, and I profiled dozens of them in the book. Let me give you just a sampling of a few. Miss Lillian, his mother, a remarkable woman who, in her youth as a registered nurse, cared for both black and white people, highly unpopular, I can assure you, in the rural South, and went into the Peace Corps in India at age 68. But she was a great defender of her son's political career. And during the 76 election, which was based on "I'll never lie to you," a reporter from New York came down to Plains and said, "Miss Lillian, now surely, having grown up and raised Jimmy Carter, seen him in politics, you know that he must have lied." "Oh, you're right, absolutely. Of course he did. He told tons of white lies." "What do you mean, Miss Lillian, by a white lie?" "Well, you remember I said how wonderful it is to have you in Plains? That's a white lie." I saw Rosalind Carter blossom from a painfully shy campaign wife who could barely speak on the stump into a remarkably accomplished First Lady, who was only the second First Lady after Eleanor Roosevelt to testify in Congress and on behalf of her own mental health bill, which she helped draft. Admiral Hyman Rickover, the stern founder of the nuclear navy and Jimmy Carter's mentor, from whom he learned the attention to detail. One mistake on a nuclear sub and you're gone. From whom he learned frugality with public expenditures and always to do your best. And two senators of opposing political dynasties, Ted Kennedy, holding the flame of his fallen brothers, hoping to take their place and be president in 1980, but dividing the Democratic Party and paving the way in part for Reagan's election. And the powerful chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Russell Long, the son of the famous Kingfish, Huey Long, the governor of Louisiana, and later, Russell was the chief of staff to Huey's brother, Earl. He told me a great story about his work with Uncle Earl. A tough re-election was coming up. Uncle Earl called all the parish leaders in the state and said, "I got to get the vote out. I'll give you bridges and roads and everything else possible. He won, and they lined up waiting for their payoff. Russell saw them and thought to himself, there is not enough money in the state of Louisiana to begin to pay for all of this. He went into Uncle Earl and he said, now, Uncle Earl, what must I tell them? Russell, it's simple. Just tell them your Uncle Earl lied. Russell was a thoroughly transactional politician who would trade his mother for a key vote and couldn't understand why the moralistic fellow Southern president wouldn't do the same. And of course, the prime player is Jimmy Carter himself. Coming from a gnat-infested hamlet of 500 people in Plains, Georgia, to the greatest position in the world, through indefatigable campaigning, but also because he had the pulse of the public. He understood that what people wanted was not another burst of the Great Society or New Deal. They wanted someone who would bring honesty and integrity back to the office. And that, together with a thematic campaign and a smile as wide as the Mississippi River, helped endear him to people, and he became everything to everyone. Now, he's been criticized for a number of things. I think he was, in many ways, the first New Democrat. Fiscally conservative, socially liberal on race and poverty, a liberal internationalist, a mild populist, a free trader, God forbid, and one who was criticized for excessive attention to detail when making a decision. He read too much, too many appendices, and I've begun to think about that in the supervening years and wonder if that's a worse way to govern than by 3x5 cards or by angry tweets. He had, on the other hand, a very odd view of politics. He was a ferocious campaigner. He did what he needed to do to win, but then he parked politics at the Oval Office door and did what he thought was right. It was his strength and his weakness. It allowed him to tackle intractable problems regardless of the political cost, but he also forgot that a president is not only commander-in-chief, he's politician-in-chief, that constantly has to nurture his base. In the end, Carter was a true centrist, too liberal for conservatives, too conservative for liberals. His guiding philosopher was the American theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, whose stern morality was the sad duty of politics is to establish justice in a sinful world. And there was about Jimmy Carter a certain modern-day Jeremiah quality, a sort of public scold in a cardigan sweater telling people to turn their thermostats down to 65 degrees to save energy. He was right, of course. But this cool, unemotional demeanor really hid very warm acts of kindness. When Hubert Humphrey had cancer, he rescheduled the leadership breakfasts weekly, yes, weekly leadership breakfasts, so that Humphrey could get his treatment at NIH, and then helicoptered him up to Camp David for what was his first and only trip to Camp David, although he served for 4 years as vice president to Lyndon Johnson. He opened up facilities in the White House like the tennis court, and no, he did not micromanage the hours, to those of us who had the time to play. And critically, opened to his senior staff and families Camp David so we could get some respite, and asked, for example, my young son Jay, you can see how young he is now, to jog with him, and routinely expressed concern that I was working too hard. So in conclusion, I believe that my book will give you a deeper view of the presidency than virtually any other history. The constant pressures, the unending demands from conflicting interest groups to make decisions affecting tens or hundreds of millions of people, oftentimes with no good options. I am not nominating Jimmy Carter for a place on Mount Rushmore, but his accomplishments should place him in the foothills, along with other major presidents who made their country and their world a better place. And that's the principal argument of my book. Thank you. now it's a question period. So I'm going to tell you another Russell Long story as we go into the question period, which Russell told me. He said he remembered when Papa came home stone cold drunk to the governor's mansion in Baton Rouge, and with great difficulty got a key to the front door of the governor's mansion and finally made the key in the keyhole align, turned it, and then Russell on the other side of the door holding on to Mama's apron strings saw Papa just collapse in the foyer with Mama, her hands folded and a stern look, waiting for an explanation as to how this state of affairs could have occurred to the governor of the great state of Louisiana. And Russell said, Papa said the following: Mama, I've completed my prepared remarks. I'll now take questions from the floor. So I assure you that Politics and Prose has only given me water, but I will take questions from the floor.
If you have a question, can you make it to that mic, please?
Well, Steve and I, thank you, Phil. Love to be. Steve and I worked in Brussels together. So, Stephen, he was my press officer.
Ambassador Eizenstat, I had the privilege of working for you 3 times, so I'm fully aware of your credentials as an internationalist. But I couldn't help remarking that you mentioned Zbig in your presentation once, and Cyrus Vance not at all. How much of their work do you attribute to the Carter administration
success? A great
success?
deal, and of course I've got a limit, Steve, on how much I can speak. The book is replete with Zbig and Vance, and I'll tell you an interesting story. During the campaign in '76, I was responsible for domestic and foreign policy, and we created task forces, including a foreign policy task force on which Cy Vance, who had been Secretary of the Army, very distinguished patrician lawyer from New York, and Zbig, who was Polish-born, had a great concept of the world, very, very anti-Soviet. And during the transition, after we won the '76 election, I was the only staff person that Carter chose to get the CIA briefings along with him. And during a break in Plains, in his modest house, he took me by the side of the house and he said, Stu, I'm thinking of appointing Zbig as National Security Advisor and Vance as Secretary of State. What do you think? And I said, Mr. President, or President-elect, each would be great, but together they don't work. Why? He said, because they have diametrically opposite views of what's going to be your crucial foreign policy challenge dealing with the Soviet Union. One is a dove, one is a hawk. Carter said, I can handle it. I like difference of opinion. You'll see in the book that there was a certain dysfunction in foreign policy because he tried to stitch together the views of 2 very conflicting people. At the end, and I believe this is the reason Vance resigned, not because of his opposition to the Iranian hostage rescue plan, although he did oppose it. I believe it was because he simply was worn down by the fight, and after the Afghan invasion by the Soviets, Carter appropriately totally came into Zbig's camp. He built up the military, increased defense spending by 5%, imposed extremely tough sanctions, and I think Cy felt the game was over and the candle was gone. But it's a very interesting relationship. But if you think that our foreign policy was dysfunctional, well...
Stu, I'd like your opinion on to what extent President Carter's deep religiosity informed his performance as president.
Well, this is a very good question, Eddie. The question is his religiosity as president. I think it had a great impact at one level and none at the other. So first of all, in terms of his personal relationships, I mean, I'm Jewish, very traditional. He had tons of Jews in his cabinet, White House staff. There was absolutely no sense of superiority because of his religion, quite the contrary. At the same time, I think he came from a branch of the Baptist movement, and this is really important to understand, that believed in the social gospel of Christ, helping the poor, bread to the hungry. This was where he came from, and the seminal event that occurred in our administration is the split in the Southern Baptist Convention when Falwell and the conservatives took over and the social gospel went out the window. So in that sense, in view of his sort of morality, his view of human rights, his liberal view on race and poverty, those were very much suffused by the social gospel. But again, not in any way, I mean, he never said he read enough decision memos. He didn't have to go to the Bible. He didn't say, I've got to check the Bible to see which box I check.
Stuart, you said in your email that we should enjoy the book as much as you enjoyed writing it. I wonder if you could address, over 40 years, if you had all the high points. And the second question is, with respect to President Carter, when he said in his speech that we had an inordinate fear of communism, and then later when Afghanistan was invaded, he said the scales had fallen from my eyes, or something to that effect. How do you explain that that transition?
Okay, well, you've asked two very different questions. I mean, the book was researched, as was indicated, back almost 40 years. I mean, I went to Brookings after we lost the election. I spent 4 months as a guest fellow at Brookings organizing these 5,000 pages of notes by alphabetical order. So literally A for abortion, A for agriculture. Every time there was a meeting on that, I put the pad number and the date. And that made it crucial for me to be able to give you the real live context of what was happening. I began my first interviews in 1989 of over 350, but that was broken up by 2 previous books, by serving 8 years with Clinton, by serving as special advisor on Holocaust issues with Obama. So it was intermittent, but once it became totally serious in terms of writing was about 4 years ago. Now, David points out a very important point, and one that was much criticized by opponents, and that is Carter said in a major speech that we have an inordinate fear of communism. And that was taken as a naive view of communism. Quite the contrary. What he meant was, we have a democracy that is so strong, our commitment to human values should be so supervening over theirs that we should not fear the contest with them. Clearly it wasn't explained well, but that really was the context in what he said. And Evans Bigg, who was as hardline as you can get, said this was totally misunderstood. Marty?
Stu, how did President Carter...
Yes, Marty, let me just go to this side. I'm sorry.
Okay. You said at the beginning of your lecture that one of the proudest achievements of the Carter administration was that he had kept the peace. What does Jimmy Carter have to say today about the permanent state of war which we have since evolved into? And also, he also described our country today as an oligarchy in which someone like him could never possibly be elected. So I wondered if you'd comment on those 2 points.
Well, on the second, let's remember that this seems like we're talking about a completely different universe. Our general election campaign, and Ford's as well, cost $20 million. 20 million, not billion, 20 million, because we had the checkoff system. We took federal funds, no private money at all, and Ford, to his credit, did likewise. Now, I mean, for an average congressional campaign, you're talking about multiples of that with unlimited donations and, the Supreme Court decision and so forth. So I think what he meant was that unless you have the capability of raising tremendous amounts of money and, yes, to some extent indebting yourself to those kinds of interests, you're going to have a hell of a hard time getting elected. Now, in terms of the issue of sort of the permanent war, look, I've limited my book to these 4 years. I don't want to start getting into where we are today. Marty?
Yeah, Stu.
So Marty was in the New York Times, and I have a little anecdote in the book where I made early on what I call a freshman mistake, because Marty said, as we were coming out of the Castle building, remember in the transition, what do you think, would you describe Carter's evolving domestic agenda. And I said, thinking because we had just barely won the election, and I remember John Kennedy's admonition that great deeds should not be done on thin majorities. So I said, I think it will be a modest legislative agenda. I had my head taken by Carter. So this guy...
As you may recall, I got occasional early morning calls from President Carter who took strong issue with something I had written. He would always say, I hope I haven't awakened you. And I'd say, no.
At 5 a.m. he had.
Right. And he would say, I've already chopped wood, walked miles, read the reports, etc. And it was like 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. But my question is, how did President Carter feel about the media?
Well, I think he felt like every president, which is that it was unfair. He felt that his accomplishments were not recognized, his failures were, that the press was always looking for the negative side of the story, for the headline, and that he didn't get a fair shake. Now, look, I mean, every president thinks that. They really do. Some take actions that are completely untoward. I mean, what he did not do is berate the press, talk about fake news and so forth. I mean, that's denigrating an important institution. But he was wounded by some of the attacks. Clearly he was. But, you know, the job of the president is to break through and to communicate to the public what you have accomplished, where you're trying to go, where you're trying to take the country, and how your accomplishments fit into that. We didn't do a great job of that, although we had, and I see Nan Powell here, her husband Jody, her late husband. I think you'll say, any reporter, he was one of the very best White House
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Press secretaries. But overarching, we did not do the job we should have. We were always fighting brush fires and not taking the broader view, which was important.
Thank you.
Gail Harrison was Walter Mondale's domestic advisor and sat in on all of our domestic policy meetings. We merged our staffs in that way.
Thank you, Stu. A speech seems like a petty thing to almost resign the vice presidency over. Could you give us a little bit of the meat of what that was about?
Okay, so if you want to go right to the heart of this book and you want to get the real Gore, not Al Gore, the real Gore, then go to the chapter dealing with the Camp David summit and picture this. Carter comes back from the G7 meeting in Japan totally exhausted. We had an energy bill which would have been his 5th scheduled. He decides he's going to cancel it. I said, Mr. President, you can't cancel a nationwide speech. I am doing it. He went to Camp David, got advice from all sorts of supposedly wise men and wise women about how to write his administration. And then Pat Cadell, who I describe as a sort of Rasputin-type 29-year-old pollster, got inside his head and Rosalind's and convinced them that the real problem that America had, the real reason his polls were down, was because of a malaise, of a sense in the public that, you know, the future would never be good and so forth. And we had a battle at Camp David that I can remember as if it were yesterday, around the very table at which the Camp David Accords were negotiated, and it was anything but peaceful. And Mondale and I were on one side, the president listening, Cadell, Ham, Jody, Rafshoon on the other. And I tell you honestly, if that had not been a large table, I think Mondale would have physically choked Cadell. He said, this is sophomoric. This is stuff I read in college. What are you talking about? The reason the American people are unhappy, the reason why your polls are down is because there's double-digit inflation. It's because people know that their real lives are being affected. And so it wasn't, Gail, just a speech. It was a whole concept. And then, lo and behold, as we modified the speech and built in an energy component to it, that speech became, and I must admit I was totally wrong about it, the most popular speech Carter ever gave. He went up 17 points in a week. And there's a very poignant story that gets to the other part of why Mondale almost resigned. And that is, after this euphoria from the statement, people said, this is the Jimmy Carter we elected. What did he do? He handed all the cabinet mass resignations. And it totally stepped on all of his headlines. And there's a beautiful story of some older woman in the mailroom who told Cadell that she had been in the mailroom since FDR's time, had read letters from the public, had never seen such a profusion of positive letters. And then she said, literally with a tear in her eyes, once the mass resignations came, they all stopped. And Mondale learned about that on the campaign trail in Tennessee. And he felt for the first time he had been cut out of a critical decision. And that's when he went into his blue phase. He had invited me to a lunch at a Chinese restaurant, which still remarkably exists because it's so horrible, right across from the National Cathedral. I think it was called the Blue Moon. It was virtually empty, and for good reason. And there he poured his heart out, and I'm the only Carter staff person who knew his true feelings, and this comes out for the first time in the book.
So before we move to the next question, we're running out of time, so we can quickly take the next 3 questions over here, and we have one more question right behind me.
Okay.
I'll make it really.
So is there something political that we take 3 from the left and 1 from the right?
Which side am I on, the left or the right? Well, thank you. It's a wonderful book, and it's a great contribution to American history. I noticed that on page 397, you're going to know what I'm going to say. You mentioned the Urban Development Action Grant
Yes.
Program, which, as you know, I was greatly involved in. And what I'd really like to know, what did it mean to the Carter administration to have that program? How did the president
Well, so
look at it?
Carter really
and-
believed, I mean, this is, again, remarkable for a guy who came from a dusty hamlet. He really understood urban problems. He went with Pat Harris to the South Bronx, and he created this Urban Development Action Grant, which was a joint public-private partnership. And it really worked. It created a lot of activity, but then it was killed in the Reagan administration and has never been seen forced. But it is a model for what we can do to try to restore urban areas and keep people there without gentrification.
Good, thank you.
Nobody here? Okay, Carla?
Since President Carter's more recent statements have been enormously progressive and incredibly courageous, how do you think he would handle the enormous global gap in economic equality, or the growing inequality which Oxfam has spoken about? And as a follow-up, this may seem unrelated, but it isn't. You know where my heart is regarding the negotiations in Northeast Asia, and I have a very, I would like your opinion. Do you think that the Trump-Bolton people will have any success in dealing with the DPRK? And if they do not, do you think that they will finally turn to Jimmy Carter, who would have a success?
Well, I'm not going to answer the last one except to say under no circumstances will they turn to Jimmy Carter on North Korea. I think there will be a deal, but that's totally outside of the book. In terms of global poverty, one of the things that, again, I mentioned in the book is the Global 2000 report, which Tom Pickering authored during the administration. And it was the first book that really, the first report that looked at global poverty, that looked at proliferation, that looked at climate change early on. It was a really marked endeavor going back to 1980. So I think this is certainly something he's infused with. Saul?
Yeah, thank you for really a fascinating presentation. You mentioned that during his administration, President Carter was very welcoming of Jews, and there were many in his administration. There are some people who say that in more recent years, he's expressed things that reflect some kind of anti-Jewish feeling. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, I mean, again, my book covers a 4-year period. I don't deal with the anti-apartheid book and so forth, which I took great exception to, told him about it, said it was a great mistake, it was an incorrect reading of history, and aligned him with the wrong sorts of people. I think that in no way is he anti-Jewish, quite the contrary. I think that what he is pro-Palestinian, and that comes from the same sort of human rights concern. He does not see that, although he doesn't express it very well. He doesn't see this as being anti-Israel. He thinks it's important to have a two-state solution, to give Palestinians a stake in the future. Again, when that report came out, the book, I was ironically at Hofstra going to give a speech with Alan Dershowitz. And Alan Dershowitz was not the Alan Dershowitz of today. He was my professor, by the way, at Harvard Law School. And he said to me, Stu, I've been asked by the New York Times to review your former boss's new book. And I said, what new book? And he said, you don't know about the new book? And I said, no. And in fact, he had not shared that book with any of his former staff. He chose the title. And when I called and found out about it, I wrote a long memo, followed up, and I said, look, why don't you do this? Just change the title, leave the rest in. He said, it's too, I understand your point, it's well taken, it's too late, the books are in, the box is going to the books. It was, I think, a terrible mistake. Ham told me that it was the worst mistake he made. And by the way, one last anecdote, because it says so much about Carter's approach. Ham said, Stu, I'm going to tell you an early lesson. If you want Carter to follow one of your recommendations, never say it will be good for you politically.